So, good morning, Nancy.
Good morning, Olivia.
Good to see you back.
Same here.
As we agreed on an email, we have an interview connecting to conference 2019 Budapest Gestalt conference, and I have a couple of questions. One is, what attracted you forward Gestalt methodology and therapy at the beginning of your professional?
Well, I was very young when I was first attracted to Gestalt therapy. Actually, I was 19 years old. I was in my first year of university, and my university was in the north of New York State, and I was back, I think, for Easter vacation, visiting my family. And friends of my father's were training with Fritz Perls. That was Frank and Ilana Rubenfeld, who were living in New York at the time. And they had organized a professional workshop, a kind of marathon with Fritz Perls in their office down in Greenwich Village in Manhattan. And there were people who were allowed to more or less sit in and watch. And my father and I were among them. And this was a huge revelation for me because I was intending to study psychology. I was just at the beginning of my studies. I was interested in psychotherapy. And what I saw there was just flabbergasting for me. I couldn't believe it. There were these adults so in touch with their emotions and expressing them and crying and being emotionally overwhelmed and seeming to understand something and have insights, and it was just almost too much. And at the end of this workshop, I thanked Fritz Perls, and he said to me, and I told him that I got so much hope from this workshop, from watching him work, and he said, no, it's young people like you who give us hope, and gave me a big kiss. And I was very shocked because I didn't expect a man of this age to kiss a girl of my age. And we went with my father's friends and several others, professionals, for dinner, and Fritz Perls was with us. We went, I remember, to a steakhouse, and he was an impossible flirt. He was eating off my plate, and just, he was a womanizer. Yeah, I was very happy that my father was around, who I usually didn't need to ward off men, but it was it was a good feeling to know that there were other adults around there. But I was fascinated by Gestalt therapy, and I started to slowly read about it and become acquainted with it. And I knew then, this is the track I want to go.
Oh, it was a huge attraction. So was it a real kiss?
I'm afraid it was.
Oh,
I'm afraid it was. And it was years later. It was years later that I met Laura Perls at the suggestion of Ilana Rubenfeld. I was living in Austria at the time with my first husband, who was Austrian. We were in New York for vacation, and I had been in training with her when I was in at the New School for Social Research, getting my master's from 73 to 74. I did training with Ilana. And she says, why don't you go meet Laura Perls? She would love to speak German with you, and she trains Gestalt therapists in the summertime when she goes to Europe. She spends every summer there. Give her a call. And we did. And she was very hospitable and welcoming. We went to visit her in her apartment, and she gave us some reprints of articles she had printed and 2 books in which she had published chapters. And we stayed in contact with her. And then for several years, we invited her in the summertime to conduct a workshop in Austria. Mm-hmm. And she came, and we were in good contact with her, and I'd visit her when we were in New York. And up till she died, about a year before she died, I wasn't getting any answers when I called or wrote. And I reconstructed that time later with her daughter, Renata, and realized she was ill and wasn't responding. Several years ago, that Renata Pearls gave me Laura's notebooks and other unpublished manuscripts and materials, and an interview that Daniel Rosenblatt had conducted with her, and that which had never been published before in English, although it was conducted in English. And I transcribed all this and annotated it and wrote a long introduction to it. There are hundreds of footnotes also to the interview, and there's a long bibliography of Laura's publications and other publications in which she's mentioned and described. Her work is described. When I got these notebooks, I was nearly overcome that Renata would entrust them to me. And I wondered why she gave them to me. And she said that Laura cared for me very much, and she trusted me, and she thought they would be in the best hands. And if she didn't give them to me, she didn't know who would be able to deal with them in a responsible way. So it was an honor, and it was also a huge responsibility, because I needed to scan them and decipher them. They were in terrible handwriting, and they were 70 years old, part of them, and the pages would more or less disintegrate under my fingers when I turned them. And I needed someone who could read the old-fashioned German script in order to decipher them. I had to pay an archivist and a historian to help me go through the books. It was quite a task. It took me 2.5 years. And it was also emotionally a kind of upheaval, because I reviewed my relationship with her and got the entire impact of her life, the way she had to flee Germany, fled to Amsterdam, went to South Africa, new country, new language, all the difficulties of the war, and losing family and friends, and then leaving South Africa again when apartheid became strong, and they went to New York, and again she had to adapt, and the children had to adapt, and naturally Fritz too, and they set up the institute. And how courageous she was, and how she constantly was the keeper of the flame of Gestalt therapy for all those decades at the New York Institute. It was very, very impressive and emotionally touching to realize that, and to read her notebooks, which were sometimes like a diary, sometimes there were letters, sometimes there were manuscripts for lectures, but they were very, very personal.
Yeah. Almost
as if I were looking into her soul, looking really right into her. And sometimes I realized how lonely and desperate she was, and that was hard to bear. Well, I'm very, very, very happy that it's available in English and in German, and also French and Spanish. So many colleagues around the world can read it.
So Nancy, I'm really interested in what kind of patients do you like to work the most nowadays?
That's an easy question. I like to work with patients who are motivated.
And how do you know?
Well, I mean, patients who can somehow deal with the contradiction of suffering from the way they are right now, the difficulties they have in their private relationships or work-related relationships, on the one hand, and on the other hand, wanting to be loved and accepted just the way they are. It's this discrepancy of, well, I want to grow and change, but don't change a hair on me, Just let me stay the way I am. And if we can work with these two extremes, then it can be a productive therapy. And I'm in it for the long haul. I often have patients for several years who really want to stay with it and want to change some major things in their lives and have me accompany them. The kind of patients I don't work with are patients who abuse different substances like drugs or alcohol. I don't work well with this population. I wasn't trained for it. And these therapies just don't work for me. I realize my own limitations here, and I recommend them to several colleagues, mostly in the Gestalt community, whom I know who are trained and have a lot of experience here and work well with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it sounds great that you have a high awareness with this part.
Well, learning by doing, I realize that if I'm not working well with a population, then I have to realize why. And I've had bad experiences working with people who have hidden substance abuse from me. I didn't know about it, and very much later on, I was aware of it, and then I realized why we weren't working well with each other.
Yeah, I understand. And you also work as a supervisor, as I know.
Yes.
What about supervisees? Is there any difference, or if somebody comes from the professional field, and there is not such differences than in patient work?
Well, it's different. You mean if they're working with people, for example, with substance abuse? That's different because it's on a different level. And I'm working with, well, a kind of parallel process. They're usually showing in supervision the difficulties that they're having with the patient, but either with me or with the supervision group. So it's kind of on a meta level, and that's easier. Oops, you're gone. Oops.
I see you.
There you are. Oh, you were gone for a second. It's on a meta level, so that's easier for me to work with all kinds of difficulties, especially in a group where there are different points of view, and usually there are one or two participants who have experience in drug or alcohol abuse. Kind of live in two worlds. I live in Austria, but I'm American. My native language is English, but I'm living in a German-speaking country, and I live in two languages and two cultures. And maybe to understand a little bit where I've come from, to know that, and to know a little bit about how I got to Gestalt therapy. They can also know that I enjoy teaching in different countries, and I've been doing that for many years on a, let's say, keeping it on a low flame, because I'm still very active in my private practice, so I'm not traveling all the time, but I like it very much. I enjoy it. Right now I'm working with supervisees or trainees in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Czech Republic, and will be in Italy and France in the next years. And I like that a lot.
Yeah, sounds very good, wonderful.
I'd also like them to know, this is the other very major point, about my publications, because this will probably be my lasting community contribution, my lasting contribution to Gestalt therapy, because I hope that my books will outlive me.
For sure, yes.
Yeah.
You also said
I co-edited Creative License, The Art of Gestalt Therapy with Margarita Spanuolo-Loeb. That's in 4 languages, and Timeless Experience is in 4 languages, about Laura Pearl's unpublished works. And I also wrote an autobiographical novel which describes very much my experience as an American in post-World War II Austria for the last 40 years. And that can give a lot of insight into the development Austria's taken also politically, and as far as xenophobia goes and anti-Semitism goes. And that's a book called Case Unclosable. And I wrote it in English, and it's also been translated into German. The EAGT is an organization that's been very significant for me for the past 20 years. I've been a member for a long time, and for several years I was on the executive board. And I've been chairperson of the Austrian Association for Gestalt Therapy, which is Austria's national organization. And I'm very happy to be the chairperson of this organization. We're very active. And up till now, I've presented at EAGT conferences. I've given lectures, or I've presented a book, or I've been on a panel, or I've moderated a panel, but I've never been asked to give a keynote speech. So your invitation surprised me and delighted me. And I said, okay, I will take on this challenge.
Wow, we are very waiting to hear you.
Yeah, and years ago for the book Creative License, I translated Ludwig Frambach's article on Salomo Friedländer from German into English. Mm-hmm. And that was, I think, the most difficult translation I ever did. I'm not a professional translator. I really did it with a lot of sweat and tears. And it was very difficult for me because I didn't really understand Friedländer and hadn't read anything by him. So this was really my introduction to Friedländer, and I found it very interesting. I was very interested that Fritz Perls was so fascinated by him. So this was my background, and it's also very important material for the lecture I'd like to give in Budapest next September. Yeah. What else would I like to say about this? Yeah, since I'm not that familiar with Friedländer's writings, I'm always happy to have a lot of time to prepare. So I'm happy that there's a long period of time for me to develop my thoughts and prepare this lecture, because it's unfamiliar territory for me. No. But as always, whenever I prepare something with which I'm unfamiliar, I learn the most. So you asked about my professional plans for the next year. So besides continuing in private practice and preparing for this keynote speech, I'm putting together a cluster of articles for the last issue of Gestalt Review in the year 2018 about the relationship between Gestalt therapy and so-called neo-phenomenology, according to Hermann Schmitz, a German philosopher. And I find these two schools of thought very incompatible, and there are several articles by Gestalt therapists and a philosopher which deal with this question, and I hope that this is interesting because it's a topic of much debate in the German-speaking world, and I would like the English-speaking world to be able to understand this, because I think it's very relevant for our discourse. Yeah, I'll be giving a keynote speech and doing a pre-conference workshop at the Czech and Slovakian joint conference in April in Mikulov, and I'm preparing for that. And yeah, that's about all.
Wow.
That's a lot.
What would you highlight connecting to your professional life, which is in connection with fertile void?
Well, first I would say that my work with patients is the most important connection to the fertile void. Just how I work with them and how we approach certain difficulties that they're having and critical situations. But I also understood your question to be what is a highlight for me in my professional career, and these are my teachers and very memorable moments with patients, and what I've learned from students, and what I learned from supervisees, and the precious contacts I have with my colleagues in Intervision. This is something that is a source of strength and support for me, and it helps me to renew my own creativity in my work.
Mm-hmm. Is there any message you would send to the conference attendees? Why do you recommend them to join?
Well, I wholeheartedly recommend people to join us in Budapest, because the EAGT conferences are enriching and stimulating regarding the contemporary theory and practice of Gestalt therapy, and it's a very rewarding experience. You can meet people, for example, whose publications you've read. You can debate with people who have different views. You can experience workshops with people you've wanted to meet and wanted to get to know their approach. There are wonderful chances for mutual exchanges, and this is a very, very unique opportunity to do it. And I think one huge boost is the fact that this next conference is going to be in Budapest, which is a wonderful city.